Good. Are we ready to go then, Laura? Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Very good to see a room with people in it again. Welcome. Really glad that you're able to make it. And for being here this evening with us for this event. And for all of those of you online with this live stream, welcome to the event as well. Actually, this is our first attempt at a hybrid event for the foundation. We've either had entirely in-room attendance and participation, or it's through the COVID period been online. So I'm sure the technology is going to work really effectively. And just on that, so that people who are watching the live stream feel included, and that's really important. If you want to contribute through the chat function, either with any comments or any questions that you have, when we come to the question or clarification or comment section of the various presentations that we hear, we'll make every attempt to include not just those from within the room, but also from those online. So we'll try and make it work as effectively as possible. Briefly, before we get underway hearing from our speakers, I want to just remind everybody why we hold this lecture and this award ceremony. It's a very short but moving autobiography that Hans Albrecht left us with. And if you have a look at it on the website, he says in his autobiography that when he had to flee Austria, he could only do so with a suitcase and a rucksack. And he was somebody who came to epitomize, at least for us on the committee here for the foundation, that he was just an ordinary childhood, experiencing an ordinary childhood. But it became extraordinary once his life collided with the very tumultuous events of the mid-20th century Europe. And he was a child like any other who just wanted to have love, he wanted security, and he wanted predictability in his life in order to thrive and flourish. And so it's really important for Eric, Barbara, and I as the trustees of this foundation that we aim to remember Hans, but importantly, we think also about the current challenges and recognize the current challenges and voices of all those children and young people fleeing persecution right now, and those who will continue to need to flee persecution into the future. So the struggle is as much about now and the future. And it's really important from our perspective that we keep this issue of children and young people fleeing persecution very much in the limelight and very much in our thoughts. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Alan. And I'm Barbara Warnock, and I'm a trustee of the Hans Albrecht Foundation, but also I'm the senior curator at the Wiener Holocaust Library, where this in-person event is coming to you tonight. So welcome to everybody in the room and online. Thank you for joining us. So before I introduce our first speaker, I just wanted to say a few words about why the Wiener Holocaust Library is a particularly appropriate location for this lecture tonight, looking at issues around refugees then and now, and for the award to the Kent Refugee Action Network tonight for their work with child refugees today. Because the Wiener Holocaust Library really is a refugee organisation in its origin. So it's founded by German Jews who first escaped persecution to Amsterdam before the Holocaust, and then came to Britain from 1939. And these people worked to gather evidence and information about the persecution of Jews in Germany and later around Europe. And an important part of our collections is that we have many archival documents and historical documents that record the experiences of Jewish refugees, including many child refugees who escaped Nazi persecution and persecution across Europe during the Nazi era. So a very appropriate place to have this talk tonight. And of course, in gathering evidence and information about the experiences of refugees, there's always also the stories of people who don't manage to get out and who can't flee persecution as well, or have very difficult journeys as they attempt to escape persecution elsewhere. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, but I'm so delighted tonight that Daniel Trilling agreed to give our annual lecture, and he's going to be talking about the theme of refugees in Europe then and now. And he's just such a great person to be talking about this subject tonight. So he's an award-winning journalist and author, and his book, Lights in the Distance, Exile and Refuge at the Borders of Europe, won Italy's inaugural Libri contro la Fame Books of Hunger Literary Prize, and was shortlisted for the 2019 Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. Trilling is also a regular contributor to The Guardian's long read and opinion sections, and writes for the London Review of Books, amongst other publications. So I'll hand over now to Daniel.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Barbara. I'm really honoured to be hosted here by the Hans Albrecht Foundation, and for the award this year to be going to Kent Refugee Action Network, whose work I've also admired for a long time. I'm going to speak now for about 20 to 30 minutes on this broad theme of refugees in Europe then and now, which is a very big subject, but I've been trying to collect a few thoughts about over the last few weeks. And I think there's going to be some time at the end for any questions that people might have as well. So, you know, hold on to those for now, and if you have questions later, I'll see if I can answer them. So I've been a journalist for about 15 years now, and for most of the last 10 years, I've been concentrating quite heavily on migration and refugee-related subjects, either here in the UK or in other bits of Europe. And there's something that I saw on my travels when I was reporting that stuck in my memory that I just wanted to tell you about first of all. So in 2014, so this is just as what we think of as the refugee crisis in Europe was just getting underway, particularly people fleeing across the Mediterranean from Libya and other bits of North Africa towards Italy. I was in a port in Sicily called Augusta, which was one of the main entry points at that point for the Italian Navy's rescue operation, Mare Nostrum. So that was a time when Italy was using its navy to go out into the Mediterranean, look for boats in distress and rescue people and bring them to land. And Augusta was one of the main ports being used for the disembarkations. And I went there a few times to sort of observe what was happening and speak to people and so on. And I think this particular time I was there, it was late August 2014. I remember seeing a large Navy vessel arriving and about 150 people that it had rescued from the Mediterranean slowly disembark. And at that time, the passengers disembarking were like a roll call of the conflicts, repression and instability affecting various parts of the world at that point. There were Syrian families. I remember a young Syrian man asking me if he could use my phone to call his family and let them know that he'd arrived safely in Europe. There were a group of Sudanese men who said that they'd come originally from Darfur and had spent many years traveling around Africa trying to find somewhere safe. There was a group of teenage Somali girls who walked down the gangplank from the ship almost as if they were on their way to school. I remember them kind of laughing and chatting as they were doing it. There was even a Palestinian family who told me they were from Gaza, who I think a few weeks earlier had left during the bombing that year. And I stood and watched this process unfold as all of these various systems that Europe has got for sort of monitoring and controlling people started to kick in. And it was as if Europe couldn't really decide whether these people were a potential threat or people who were in need of help. So I remember before the passengers were allowed off the boat, you had these military and medical specialists go in and check for communicable diseases and check for weapons. The police went on board, checked for potential terrorism suspects or potential people smugglers, and so on. And it was only after that point that then all of the medical services and NGOs could start dealing with people and working out, well, what needs do people have? Do people have medical needs that must be treated urgently? Are there particularly vulnerable people like lone children or other, people with other kinds of vulnerabilities that need kind of more acute help at that point? And I think that scene has really stuck with me because the image of a ship, of a vessel that can offer passage to safety, looms large in our understanding of displacement, and I think quite often shapes the way that we talk about it. I think on the one hand, that's because it symbolizes what we can do when we direct our resources and our energy towards protecting life, but it also suggests that our capacity to help might be limited. That too many people trying to clamber on board might capsize us, might drag us all down with it. And that ambiguity, I think, is right at the heart of the political debate over migration and refugees in the UK at the moment, and Europe more generally, in fact. There was a considerable backlash to the refugee crisis of 2014, 2015, that really rested on that fear of being overwhelmed, that was inflated and exploited by right-wing populist politicians all around Europe. And one of the results of that is that European governments have, they started to harden their borders. I think if you look at the reactions, for instance, to the US and allied withdrawal from Afghanistan last summer, when the Taliban took over the country very rapidly, kind of first reactions in European media were to talk about the coming wave of Afghan refugees, as if this was going to be a kind of, sort of one of the worst aspects of the disaster in Afghanistan would be it would cause harm to Europe, which it was as if, there isn't already an Afghan refugee crisis that has been going on for 40 years. In the UK, the rise in small boats crossing the Channel has been frequently misrepresented in the media and by some of our leading politicians as an overwhelming rise in the number of people coming to the UK to seek asylum. And again, it's that fear, the fear of the ship being overwhelmed. And I think there's a particularly horrible irony in the fact that part of that backlash has involved attacks being made on the Royal National Lifeboat Institution for doing what they exist to do, which is to go out into waters at sometimes considerable danger to themselves and save lives. And that fear of displaced people has become, because of the reactions that our governments have made in response to those fears, have become a really powerful political tool that can be then used to manipulate geopolitical conflicts even, and to kind of further entrench those fears. And I think what we've seen on the borders between Belarus and the European Union in the last year or so really underlines that. It's the decision by Belarus to encourage migrants and refugees to come to Belarus and then try and cross into the European Union was incredibly cynical and callous, but it had political power because that fear was there, among our governments here in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. And where politicians have given into those fears of being overwhelmed, I think that is having real effects. It's changing the nature of our laws, and I think it risks changing the nature of our society as well. To understand what's happening, I think we only have to look at the Nationality and Borders Bill that the UK government is currently moving through Parliament. So the UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, is among many voices criticising that bill because it's what it proposes for the asylum system in the UK risks undermining a fundamental principle of refugee protection, which is that everybody has the equal right to asylum if they need it. And what the bill does, as I'm sure many of you here are familiar with, is it essentially proposes creating a two-tier system of asylum whereby people who don't do as the British government would like, people who travel via routes that the British government doesn't want them to travel by, will be given harsher treatment, and their claims will be looked on less favourably. And I think elsewhere in Europe, we're seeing a similar erosion of rights at the moment, whether that's in the increasingly open use of pushbacks. So those are actions by particular countries, military or even paramilitary groups linked to the state to force asylum seekers back over borders into situations where they may well be in danger. You know, this has now been well documented in Greece, in Croatia, and in several other countries as well. Or it might be the outsourcing of immigration control to countries where there are serious human rights abuses going on. So the most disgusting of those, I think, is the way that Europe collectively has outsourced immigration control in North Africa to Libya, even though the appalling conditions for migrants and refugees in Libya have been well documented, you know, for years and years, going back to the days of Gaddafi even. So that's a situation where I think nobody can say we didn't know what was happening. And within Europe as well, I think you're seeing other forms of this erosion of rights in the warehousing of refugees, you know, the building of camps where people, sort of the claim as they're built is that these will just be temporary situations. You know, these are processing centers where people will move through quickly, or, you know, once other refugees, other migrants see how basic the conditions are in these camps, it will lead, you know, it will stop this particular form of migration. But in reality, these are becoming permanent sites. So, you know, Greece is kind of a leading example of where camps that were set up as temporary emergency measures in the midst of the crisis of 2015 are now being turned into these permanent and, in the words of the Greek government, closed structures that are starting to resemble detention centres. So I think hopefully that kind of fairly brief run through of several different contexts around Europe today shows that there's a pattern there. And I think one sort of justification for this shift that we're seeing, that I very often see made by advocates of changes to the system, so perhaps advocates of the UK government's policies at the moment, is that the international system for refugee protection, which was largely established in the aftermath of the Second World War, is no longer appropriate for our time. So in an age of increasing global migration, so would go this argument, and the prospect of even greater displacement from climate change in the years to come, our systems need to be adapted. You know, so the idea is, well, yes, it was all well and good doing, setting up a system like this in, you know, the 1950s, but the world is different now. We need a system that is more suitable to the time we live in, more flexible and responsive, allows governments more discretion in their refugee and asylum policies. Advocates of this shift don't always say it openly, but I think what they mean in practice by adaptation is finding various ways in which countries can effectively pull up the drawbridge, to deny help to refugees in need, or to be far more selective about those they offer help to. But is that really so different to what we've seen in the past? And is the situation now so different from the 1950s or the 1930s even? You know, there are, we could be here all evening debating this, and I would do you a favor by not going into too much of the fine detail, but actually what I wanted to do at this point is just tell you a little family story that I think helps us think about the differences between then and now, and why these arguments against universal refugee protection are, I think, bogus and ill-founded. So my grandmother, Teresa, was a refugee twice in her life. First as a child, fleeing Kiev during the Russian Civil War in about 1920, where her and her mother had to cross through what was then the borderlands between the Russian Empire and Poland, you know, paying smugglers to take them across, not knowing if they would reach their destination, whether they would be, you know, robbed or attacked or worse, but eventually ending up in Berlin. And then my grandmother was made a refugee a second time after having grown up in Berlin as a young woman, when she was forced to leave by Nazi persecution, and came to London in August 1939, a few days before war was declared and the borders were closed. And I grew up very near to my grandmother. She either lived down the street or actually in my house for most of my childhood. So I heard her stories of her life very often. So, you know, I grew up thinking about what would I have done in that situation? And I think as a journalist, it gave me a real interest in what's life like for people in what might be similar situations today. And I think those two journeys that my grandmother Teresa took tell us two really important points that are just as relevant today as they were in the 30s. And they were immediately after the Second World War, when the system for refugee protection that we have now was being set up. So that first journey she took as a child was one that made her stateless. Was what happened after the Soviet Union was established, was that Russians outside the borders of the Soviet Union were stripped of their citizenship by decree. And at that time, there wasn't a system to enable people to access rights in other countries. It was at the discretion of every different nation state whether it would give stateless refugees citizenship and therefore a set of rights that they could access. And my grandmother was very lucky, along with her parents, to benefit from the first stab at an international form of refugee protection, which was this system of what were called Nansen Passports, which were issued in the 20s and I think up to the 30s, specifically for stateless Russians and stateless Armenians in the wake of the First World War. And when I was a child, my she used to tell us about her Nansen passport a lot, and the way she talked about it was a sort of, you know, she would rhapsodize about this wonderful document that allowed you to go wherever you want and you didn't belong to any particular country. And, you know, the piece of paper was white, and that seemed to sort of symbolize this sort of openness that provided. And I think, so that underlines the first point, that a system for protecting refugees today still has to be founded on the idea of rights. You know, it's not just about handing out charity or helping people in camps. It's about allowing people to become members of communities that they've had to enter at quite short notice by informal routes or without the correct documents or any of the things that we might take for granted that allow us to go about our daily lives as citizens that, you know, have rights and can enjoy them. By the time my grandmother made that second journey as a refugee in 1939, she'd actually lost the Nansen passport because she had become a German citizen by that point. And that second journey was made almost impossible by the system of international borders that existed at the time. So there wasn't an automatic right of safe passage for refugees wanting to escape Nazi persecution in the late 1930s. In 1938, you know, there was an awareness that this was an issue and something should be done about it. But in 1938, all of the world's most powerful countries got together at something called the Evian Conference to discuss what should be done about it. And the outcome of that conference was essentially they couldn't decide what to do. And therefore not much was done at that international level. And one of the big sticking points was that particular nation states allowed those fears of being overwhelmed by immigration to dictate what they were willing to put forward as proposals for this a solution to this problem. So at the Evian conference, the UK's representative said, the United Kingdom is not a country of immigration. Australia's representative said, we have no real racial problem here in Australia, and we're not desirous of importing one. Other countries only agreed to take in refugees on the basis of what skills would be useful for their economies. So I think that points to another really sort of crucial point about refugee protection, which is that it needs to be universal. And as the system that was set up as the set up after the end of the Second World War, at least has as its ideal, everybody should be treated as an individual when they claim asylum and have their particular circumstances taken into account. My grandmother, in fact, was only able to reach the UK because a friend went ahead and procured, somehow, we don't know, a purported offer of work, because at the time the restrictions were you could only come into the UK if you could show that you had a job waiting for you. And she was so worried about being sent back that when she arrived at Liverpool Street Station on the train from Harwich, I think, where the ferry arrived, she ripped up her German passport on arrival, so that it would be harder for somebody to send her back. And I'm reminded of those stories. And in fact, of the many stories of people that I met while reporting around Europe that echo them, when I see the current debates about our asylum system, you know, when there's a disaster in the Channel and there's this kind of what I see as this kind of faux concern coming from the corners of politics that are normally very kind of anti-immigration or very kind of hardline on these questions of borders, asking things like, why did people take such a dangerous journey in the first place? Why didn't they go by the proper routes? Why didn't people stay in the first safe country they reached? As if that, you know, if you see it from the perspective of somebody fleeing and trying to get to a place of safety, makes sense at all. And that's because those sorts of complexities, you know, that you don't always follow the rules, that you can't always make predictable decisions, that the decisions you make are based on what's available to you at that point, whether that's information or money or even, you know, the knowledge about where to go. Those are inherent to the experience of being displaced. People make the choices that are available to them at any particular time. They don't always follow the rules or do what they are told. Mainly because if people did that, then they would have likely stayed in the places that were threatening to their safety and may well no longer be alive. And I think this seems to be the thing that politicians at the moment, particularly in the UK, are unwilling to acknowledge and to bring into their discussions of how you create a kind of fair and successful asylum system. And I think it tells us something else as well when we think about what happened, particularly in the 1930s, particularly with the way that the UK related to what was going on in Europe, which is that just as importantly, the people who step in to offer help are very often having to work against the systems in which they live. That's either because of political hostility to what they're trying to do, or perhaps bureaucratic indifference or incompetence. But I think that's a constant. You know, it's really common for British politicians, even politicians that are putting forward very hardline immigration policies, hardline asylum policies, to invoke what they call our proud history of welcoming refugees. Well, there are moments in Britain's history that we should rightly be proud of and we should celebrate. But I think we're prone to forgetting the struggles that it took to make those moments happen. And the Kindertransport, which is obviously the initiative that provided a place of safety to Hans Albrecht, as it did to, you know, hundreds of other children in the late 1930s, had to happen because the British government wouldn't put in any wider scheme of resettlement and safe passage for people fleeing Nazi persecution in Europe. And its success and the way that the children who were rescued went on to have happy and successful lives in Britain is, I think, an example of where members of the public were ahead of politicians in estimating the capacity of our society to care for and protect people in need. And again, I think that's a constant, that idea that actually, you know, the dominant political arguments actually sort of underplay, sort of undersell ourselves, underestimate our own capacity, is something that certainly in the course of my reporting, I saw come up again and again, not just in the UK, but in lots of different bits of Europe that I visited. So that might have been the, you know, people in Greece, which itself was going through a severe economic crisis, suffering the effects of these really brutal austerity policies, lining the streets of northern Greece near Thessaloniki during the summer of 2015, and handing out water, food, clothing, you know, other necessary items to people who were making their way north through the Balkans at that point. Or it might be the work done in the camps in Calais and elsewhere by volunteers and aid workers from Britain who were working to identify vulnerable children and bring them to the UK, very often having to fight an unresponsive Home Office or to push for changes in the law in Parliament in order to make that happen. And I think you can see that again within the UK today through the work of organisations like Kent Refugee Action Network. You know, the kind of basic practical help and solidarity of providing activities and resources to help children and young people settle into new lives in the UK, or providing support to them as they negotiate their way through the asylum system, or perhaps through local authority social services, you know, both of which, sometimes against people's best intentions, can be extremely difficult and sometimes harmful bureaucracies to work with, particularly when it comes to vulnerable young people. But it's exactly that kind of work that actually, you know, it's really, really important on a direct practical level, but it also kind of sets an aspiration. It's a way of saying, well, you know, our society has got the capacity to do with, and perhaps there are, you know, better and bigger ways that we can organize ourselves to do that. Just to conclude, I think when we talk about displacement, you know, particularly on these kind of big international levels, as I've been doing this evening, it can very quickly start to seem overwhelming. You know, it's difficult to talk about solutions without also talking about how to solve, you know, the racism and prejudice that can accompany immigration and cultural difference, or the increasingly violent ways that our governments are choosing to police their borders at the moment, or even of the wars and inequalities that cause people to leave their homes in the first place. But I think that's why that kind of direct practical response, that willingness to just intervene in the situation on the ground, either right in front of you or where you think it's needed, is so important. It reminds us that we don't have to wait for any of these bigger questions to be resolved to help people in the here and now. But I think it's also to make a wider reaching statement. It's to say, essentially, we do have the capacity, that there is enough room on board the ship. And that, to me, seems like an ideal starting point for addressing some of these bigger questions that we face in Britain and Europe today. So thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. That was really fascinating, thought-provoking, and slightly depressing, but with some positives as well. I don't know if I'm in the camera. So yeah, if there are any questions from the audience, then we can take them. I've got a microphone here, or I don't know if there's any questions online at the moment, not at the moment. So yes, any questions from our audience in person here? Or you can shout out. Yes, do you want to try shouting? I can always relay it for the online audience.
I'm interested to know how you think you can shift the narrative towards
So the question for those online was how, if Daniel has any ideas about how we could shift the narrative in order to create circumstances that would be more appropriate for the situation with refugees that we find ourselves in just now.
Sure. I don't need to use that one.
No, you just...
Yeah, so I suppose on the political level, you know, in the UK at least, the reforms to the asylum system are part of this wider set of bills that the government is bringing through, where it wants to make changes to our wider system of rights protections. And there's a lot of work being done by campaigning organizations and other groups who are experts in all of those different fields to sort of raise awareness of why some of those changes are quite dangerous, and to build a coalition of support, you know, sort of inside and outside Parliament to, if not defeat all of these bills entirely, to make changes to them that will shave off the most harmful elements. And I think there has been a quite encouraging amount of success there already in terms of the way that you've had actually a coalition of groups from sort of like radical campaigners outside Parliament, but then particularly in the House of Lords, representatives from kind of the left, the centre, and some parts of the right that are more concerned about civil liberties work together to argue against what's happening. I think the way in which the Lords defeated quite a few of the amendments to the policing bill, which then got, I think, got quite favourable coverage in quite a lot of the press where you might not have expected it to have done is an encouraging sign. And I think that's because it was such an obvious sort of broad coalition of people saying, well, actually, there's lots of different reasons why we do need these rights. And I think it's that kind of approach that I think will help with the changes relating to refugees particularly. But obviously that's, you know, we can support those kind of campaigns, but much of that happens at this level way above our heads. I think for most of us, the way in which changing narratives work is working out what are the particular circumstances in the communities that you live in, you know, and what actually, what kind of meaningful activity there can start perhaps either making people and their experiences more visible, or perhaps raising awareness of particular issues in a way that people will actually engage with because it relates to their particular circumstances there, or bringing parts of communities that have tended to remain quite separate together. And I think it's only when that work's going on that you can start to talk about how you build on top of that. So I wonder, I mean, it's my being a South Londoner who lives nearest to Kent, I've sort of got my eye on Kent quite a lot, and it seems like there's a lot of that kind of work going on there at the moment, because Kent has become such a focus of the media because of the small boats issue, because particularly with unaccompanied children, it's where many of them are made to live when they arrive, that there are sort of efforts to both not only provide that kind of practical help that I was talking about earlier, but actually to show that people in Kent are open to welcoming people into their community, and that it's inaccurate for, say, you know, right-wing populists with a YouTube account and a camera to come in and make it look like everybody who lives there hates immigration and is against what's happening. But that's, you know, there's an example of where it's really specific to a particular part of the UK. But I think that's, to me, really important, that the circumstances will be different everywhere, and so it's really about thinking about, well, where I live, what are the kind of interventions that I or people that share my ideas could make in the community around us.
Thank you, Daniel. So I've got a question that has come in from the audience online from MB, and they're asking if you have any thoughts on what they're calling the consistency of the attitudes of governments towards refugees over the years. And perhaps you might question whether those attitudes are consistent, but they say, is this consistency from a place of racism or anti-Semitism, or perhaps from the need to control people from the point of view of the state, or something else?
I mean, the short answer is it's probably all of those things, perhaps in different combinations at different times. But I think, again, I'd just stress the fact that governments can be made to change their minds. You know, I used the example of the kinder transport earlier because that is one where it became very clear, you know, so I'm not an expert in the history of the mid-20th century, but from what I have read about sort of refugees sort of before and during the Second World War, there were a series of events where the government basically thought, oh, no, we can't do this because the British population there'll be just a horrible backlash among the British population. And then it turned out that they'd underestimated people. So I think the fact, you know, the people who campaigned to make the kinder transport happen showed that. But there was another instance, slightly different issue, but you know, again, where the government interned what were called enemy aliens, initially in a camp outside Liverpool, where there was a huge public outcry in the neighborhood at the conditions people were being kept in. A more recent example, I think, is from the peak of the refugee crisis, when David Cameron was the Prime Minister. Initially, he said Britain wouldn't increase resettlement of Syrian refugees. Then in the autumn, late summer and early autumn of 2015, if people remember, there was that photograph of the little boy, Alan Kurdi, who had died as his family tried to cross from Turkey to Greece. that went viral and prompted all of those huge protests in cities all around the world, including London, Cameron actually had to relent on his earlier stance and say that and agree to resettling 20,000 people from refugee camps around Syria. So while the things that make governments behave in that often harmful way might be constant, the ability to push back and to change them, and you might not be able to kind of arrive at the perfect solution, but at least to win meaningful and important concessions is really important to remember that part of the picture as well.
Thank you. So yes, there's a question there.
Yeah, so Javier, thanks so much. First of all, it's not great to get thoughts on relative fear, the topic by surrounding the issue of phobia, because I'm narrative that lots of us there is like good refugees and there is bad refugees, and we're not so fond of like refugees, and also I think there's also certain aspects of what refugees bring to the table. So, for example, in my people seem to be very welcoming towards food. Everybody loves food and wants to have that, and that's good kind of thing of what refugees bring on. And then everyone is like more kind of like scared or like fearful of other which are cultural practices. Try to simply ask or Christian world, so to speak.
So I'll just try and summarize it for the audience online. No, that's all right. So the question is to do with if Daniel's got any thoughts or ideas about how you might challenge the fear that sometimes governments or other people seem to have of perhaps certain kinds of refugees, of the way that sometimes refugees are perceived as sort of good or bad, and there might be certain groups of refugees who are somehow considered less desirable. So, for example, perhaps Islamophobia drives a fear of Muslim refugees, was an example given. So yeah, there's kind of discussion about that. I think that's probably
yeah. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that is a particular sort of kind of fear that drives politics, and also yes, again, there is a lot of, I wouldn't say it's kind of continuity as such, but patterns repeat themselves, I think, or echo one another. So as a journalist, I've written quite a lot about the far right and sort of racism in Britain and sort of the roots of anti-immigration politics and so on. And one thing that always struck me about that is that there's you sort of, particularly when you read the history of it, there's always this kind of refrain that, people will say, well, we don't like this particular group of immigrants or people who have this particular shared cultural background. And the response will be, well, yes, but what about people who came 20 or 30 years ago? And the refrain will always be, oh yes, well, that was different. That group was fine, but it's this new group who are too different. And that's why we should be afraid. Well, that's why we should have those fears. And I think people have got very short memories in that respect. There are ways in which Islamophobia very strongly resembles anti-Semitism and ways it doesn't, and so on, and those appear at different historical points in different ways. But I think if you look at the kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric around Jewish immigration to the UK in the first half of the 20th century, you see the same patterns and the same kind of things that are now said about people who come from majority Muslim countries, for instance. The way to deal with that, I think to a certain degree, is just to confront it and point these things out and to reject it rhetorically. But this is also a question about how we live together, and it kind of goes back to that answer I gave earlier. And I think one of the ways in which you make community, so this isn't just a question about so-called immigrants and so-called natives, the way people live successfully together is it's an ongoing project. It doesn't just happen naturally, and you need organizations, you need support from the state, you need sort of work being done by organizations like Kent Refugee Action Network to actually help people make successes of their lives, you know, as part of a community. And again, you need to oppose it on that rhetorical level, I think, but if that's all that happens and there isn't this kind of big collective effort on the ground, it's not enough.
Thank you. Yes, I think we have sort of slightly run out of time there for more questions for Daniel, but thank you so much for a really fascinating lecture, and also thank you to everyone for your questions too. So I'm now going to hand over to Eric, who is going to present the Hans Albrecht Award for 2022. So first of all, just join me in thanking Daniel once again.
Manage the tricky combination of periods and Yes, good evening. My name is Eric Millstone, and I am one of the trustees of the Hans Albrecht Foundation. I knew Hans. He lived around the corner from me. We became friends. We're both children of Austrian refugees. We had quite a few things in common, and like Hans. And I was enthusiastic about participating in this foundation. And I'm also particularly enthusiastic about the choice of recipient for this year's award. We have chosen to give this year's award to the Kent Refugee Action Network. And the more I hear about it, the more I listen to your presentation, the more convinced I became that you are worthy recipients. So, and I should do more than just refer to you as an organization, but individuals. We have with us the chief executive, Rachel, does that answer the question of which of you will receive the award? Well, okay, well, the chair, Joseph, the deputy chair, Barbara Scott, and the media lead, Bridget Chapman. I'm delighted you're able to come here. I'm so delighted that you're willing to accept this award. Sorry, okay. I like to think my voice can reach the back without amplification. The Kent Refugee Action Network was founded, I think it was 2003, but as time evolved, it came increasingly to focus on the needs of young people. There are several reasons for this, as I understand, one being that Kent County Council could move adults out of the county and disperse them elsewhere, but with young people, they weren't empowered to do so. Therefore, they had to take responsibility for them. And what's so wonderful about the Kent Network is that they both directly provide help and support to the young people, but also in the way that Lana suggested, demonstrate to the wider community that there are lots of people in Kent willing to and enthusiastic to help and support these young people. And also, one of the things that I particularly appreciate about the network is the way in which you develop networks of support amongst the young people you're helping. I see enormous value in that. My parents came to this country as political refugees from Vienna in the late 30s, and they knew nobody. I mean, my parents lived quite close to each other in Vienna, but actually they met in London. And they both arrived knowing nobody. And understandably, refugees would gather together amongst the people with whom they had something in common such their language, their culture, their customs, their dietary habits, and so on, their recipes. And from the late 30s, right through to the end of their lives, their network of friendship sustained them, without which they would have been completely lost. So this is just one of the many reasons why I'm delighted to be able to present this modest certificate to the Kent Refugee Action Network. And Rosie, if you'd like to come forward, please, I will. So who will be speaking?
We have our chair.
Yes, okay.
And then Bridget.
Bridget.
And then we have two lovely youth ambassadors.
And they have arrived.
At the back. And they have,
Okay,
that's what
splendid.
I'm
Welcome.
sitting at the back because I was waiting for them.
Okay. We look forward to hearing from you.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yeah.
Face the camera.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. But I'll let the chair and the media lead and the youth ambassador speak on our behalf.
Splendid. Thank you very much
Thank you
indeed.
so much.
My voice definitely doesn't reach the other side of the room without some amplification. Ooh, that was a glass behind me. It's all right. Thank you all for attending and giving us the honor of receiving this recognition for our work. We are a very small Kent-based charity, and we clearly punch above our weight. History coming out of a local humanitarian response to the boat people from Vietnam. Our work relates to the understanding of humanity, which I think we share with the Hans Albrecht Foundation and with the Wiener Library. And the experience of Hans with special needs arriving in the UK and making a life for himself against all the odds. We help the young people to get into the mainstream of education where that is possible. And we respect them as they are. We don't ask them why they're here or how they got here. That may come up in conversation, but we mostly aim for making them welcome. We have a central office in Canterbury and hubs in East Kent, mainly. And we provide education support to new arrivals and a mentoring service and an advocacy service. We have a central of, oh, sorry, I've already been there. We are getting more flexible in the way we are providing services because we are beginning to develop access points where the asylum seekers are housed, which changes over time with the fluctuations of the availability of housing. In our overall strategy, young people's voices are at the heart of what we do, and we involve our youth ambassadors in our work. They often help make the links with other refugees and asylum seekers and us because of their shared experience, by their own history of understanding the vulnerability of the early stages after arrival and their language abilities when they come from communities which have a shared language as themselves. More about them later. Two growth areas have been the demand for signposting asylum seekers from a wider geographical area than just Kent. And the other area of growth is demand for the media, from the media, for commentary on the arrival of refugees in Kent and the local and national response to their arrival. Mostly driven by our location being the first landing space for new arrivals and the pressure this puts on social services to fulfill their statutory duties towards unaccompanied minors. The focus of KRAN is to support people who are refugees or displaced persons, mainly in Kent, in particularly by the provision of advice and information, which often relates to housing, their rights in relation to finance and social services, and their rights in the asylum-seeking process, and signposting them to the right organizations, advocating where necessary. We have had 350 people seeking that kind of help in 2021, providing education classes in English and maths, facilitating access to mainstream education. We had 150 people coming to our classes in 2021, organizing social activities, trips, art-based classes, as well as a WINS support for the wives of those people who have come after their husbands have been recognized as refugees. We are now asked sometimes to help with the Syrian resettlement families too, by some of the local authorities that they land in. Providing support by teaching about our culture and how things work, as well as providing an opportunity to have a mentor, which can help with all of the above. In 2021, we've had 105 mentoring partnerships. Our media involvement has grown, and we have started to play a larger role in influencing local and national debate about asylum seeking. And we aim to use our position, experience, and knowledge to amplify the voices of the people with lived experience to raise public awareness, inform policy, and influence the practice to the benefit of the groups that we serve. We have created 5 part-time posts for young people with lived experience to act as ambassadors, and they go out to meet the requests for information from statutory bodies, health service, police, and even attending a parliamentary committee. And you will hear from them in a minute. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Excellent. It's a big honor to be here tonight. Thank you so much. And I'm a huge fan of Daniel's work, so it's particularly exciting to hear him speak. When we were told we were getting this award, I read up on Hans Albrecht, who sounds frankly like the most extraordinary person. And then when I knew the event would be held here, I started reading up on Alfred Wiener. Did I say that correctly? Thank you. I was worried. After whom I understand this library is named. He was, as you've heard from Barbara, a German Jew who spent years documenting the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. After the war, his collection of documents and materials was used by the United Nations War Crimes Commission to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. That material now resides here in this library and is, I imagine, a sobering reminder of the myriad of ways in which people from different marginalized groups can be dehumanized by the media and by relentless propaganda in order to make attacks on them more palatable for society. We can see today how attacks on migrants and asylum seekers dehumanize them, softening society up for the hostile environment, an environment in which we place victims of torture in squalid conditions in former army barracks, where they will be re-traumatized, an environment in which armored jet skis are proposed to push back terrified people in dinghies, and in which those who arrive bedraggled, hypothermic, and very often injured are left to languish on the concrete floor of inadequate facilities after they have arrived and should be safe. I believe passionately that one of the most important aspects of the work that KRAN does is to intervene in the conversation about migration and asylum to change that conversation for the better. Locally, I think we have made great strides. When I first moved to Kent 8 years ago, the coverage in the local press hadn't moved on from 1998, when Kent police threatened to charge several local editors with inciting racial hatred. Most notably, the Dover Express published an editorial that year which contained the following paragraph: illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, bootleggers, and scum of the earth drug smugglers have targeted our beloved coastline. We are left with the backdraft of a nation's human sewage and no cash to wash it down the drain. Over the past few years, we have worked with the Dover Express, the Folkestone Herald and others, now under the Kent Live brand, to completely change this narrative. Kent Live regularly publish articles busting some of the myths around seeking asylum and often highlight the many and varied combinations made by migrants that enrich and strengthen our communities. Importantly, within the last 2 years, Kent Live made the radical decision to stop calling those people arriving in small boats migrants and decided to call them people. They put a text box in every piece they run on this topic explaining why they made the decision. And it is, I think, a really important change. On the surface looks minor, but is so, so key. Let me be clear, there is nothing wrong with being a migrant. People have moved for centuries and we are all, in some way, the wonderful product of migration. But in this specific context, the word migrant has become loaded. It's paired relentlessly with words like suspected and illegal, framing those arriving instantly as criminals or potential criminals. What the word people does instantly is humanize. It's factually correct, and it does something very important. It puts the reader on the same level as the person arriving in a boat. We are all, after all, just people. So that's one part of how I hope we've made a difference. But of course, the important voices here are not mine or Yoss's or Razia's. They are the voices of those with lived experience of seeking asylum. And a priority for us is to skill up and empower the incredible young people we work with to be able to speak directly to the media when and if they're ready and on their own terms. So we are working very hard in both in-house and with partner organizations to do just that. It's an absolute priority for us. Just last week, we finally got a new project off the ground. If you use Instagram, please watch out for Humans of Kent, humans_of_Kent, which is a joint project between the photographer Alan Compton, Brighton-based, and KRAN. It has 3 main aims. Firstly, aims to give young people the media skills they need, but by making them the interviewer rather than the interviewed for a change. Secondly, aims to give them world-class training in sound recording and editing, photography, lighting, production, and post-production. And finally, aims to expose the layers of migration that make Kent, like everywhere else in the UK, the place it is today. So thank you for recognising the work that we do. It means an awful lot, especially here in this library setting, and it shows us that we're definitely doing something right. But now, I would like to hand you over to some of the most important people in KRAN by a long way, our youth ambassadors, Rishan and Osama. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If you want to move it on yourselves, you can do that. That's that way. Or you can just tell me to move it on.
I can do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for inviting us for this huge event. It's just a big honor for us to be awarded this.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for today, for coming and for inviting us to be here. It's really big achievement for us, and we're really excited to be here. So thank you.
So basically, when our CEO told us about doing a presentation, the first thing we thought about is to show you the work we do, and we need to start first with ourselves, who we are and what we do. So basically, my name is Osama Sharkia, and I am a Syrian refugee who came to the UK in 2018 through the Syrian resettlement scheme. And I started in KRAN as a student, so I was just learning English and then became a trainee and now as a youth ambassador. And currently I'm doing computer science at Christchurch University.
So hi again, my name is, I'm really loud. Can you hear me? So hi again, my name is Rashan Sagai. I'm from Eritrea. I came in 2015 to the UK as a refugee. I came alone at the age of 17. Then I've been placed with a foster family, like English family, which is, I really love them. Then I've been introduced to KRAN again to study English and basic and knowing other young people as well from different Afghanistan, Syria and other things. Now I'm studying in Christchurch University. I'm doing adult nurse. I want to be a nurse and work in the NHS. So that's my background. It's everything about me. So yeah. So as Bridget said and everyone says, we work in KRAN as a youth ambassador, which is really honored, to be honest, because we know KRAN since we came to here, and then to be work closely with them is really achievement. So one of the things that we do at KRAN is representing refugees, like representing our story and telling the media, as everyone you said earlier, like how it's misrepresented. So we tell our real story and how we want it to be told, instead like all this negativity that comes across. So we go outside there and then just tell who we are, and that's how we, if you would like to know us, that's we are. So yeah.
The second part of our job is to speak to the young refugee asylum seekers and support them in our classes through different skills, because all of us speak different languages. So basically it's so valuable for us and for them to speak to someone who knows their language, so just to assure them and build their trust up. So we usually collect evidence from them, about the issues that concern them and about the challenges, and share that with the KRAN.
You see here, I can't see them. So make sure young refugee voices are really, so it's similar as I said earlier. And as a user, like we have a youth forum, like we gather together and we tell our issues, what challenges that we face and how we can like overcome all this challenge. So one of the things is what we do in the youth forum, after we gather all this collected, and then we go to KRAN, either Razia or Bridget or any KRAN members, how we can make this issue, like how we can fix it and how we can tackle it. So that's the voice that we give it back, give it to the KRAN. Other thing that we can do it, like other organization, if we can't do that, work closely together and it can be one voices and just one be particular separately. So yeah.
We try always to kind of expand the youth forum. So basically the youth forum is a group of young refugees and asylum seekers who have been here in the UK for more than 1 year, who speak good English, and we usually meet on a regular basis to discuss different issues, different challenges, and different things to be solved. And part of our job is just to expand this youth forum by kind of talking to young people about the KRAN, about the work we do, and how can we encourage them more to join us.
Again, I have to go back there. So I think in this one, and similar is representing youth voice in Kent in UK debate and forum, that kind of link to what we do with the what we've done with Safe Passage and the tackling the new bill anti-refugees that we call it now. So became as one voice, and how we can do it, looking to the family reunion, other issues that like facing the refugees instead, like just one particular issue.
And also not just this, we always try to also kind of join the local youth forum groups, like for example the British Youth Council, or like for example the Act for Change State group, to kind of to make our voice heard in a wider community, so we can deliver this message in the best way. Next, our challenges.
This I know it by heart. So one of the challenge, obviously, is not just us as a KRAN. I mean, everyone had been hit by the pandemic and facing whether it can be delayed, whether it can be anything. So as we start as a youth ambassador, the first thing that is comes is this one. So we couldn't like see the young people and to work closely with them, as we just mentioned. And then we tried as hard, like much that we can do it through online. But again, some of the young people, they don't know IT. Some of them, they don't have the access for the phone, or again, one of the issue that we've been trying to tackle with it. The pandemic really took part of this, like challenging to us. But again, it did work. And the other like opposite, which is we had a like meeting with the Lords and meeting with the Parliament, so member of the Parliament. So again, it was challenging, and then again, it was beneficial at the same time.
Yeah. One of the other challenges is isolation that hit our young people through the pandemic. So basically, it was so hard for us to kind of be in touch with them and also to assure them that something is not. We kind of tried our best to be their older brothers and sisters, kind of to make them feel comfortable during the pandemic, which was so hard. So basically, it was just like difficult for us and for them. But using our languages, using the trainings we have in KRAN, using also the time we knew them, all of that made the things easier.
One of the issue, again, this is all issue to be honest. The housing, not as just as a youth ambassador, but as KRAN as well, as a like KRAN team. The housing, the issue, I mean, the young people, they come always like this house, like we're living with the, like some young people who like doing drugs or doing other things. So it would really hard for us to kind of tackle this issue. But again, through one of the fund that we had from Challenging Change, we come up with the idea that we can record and then tell the young people awareness about the housing. Obviously, we're not going to give them like a hotel or 5-star as the media, like mentioning that was how a refugee have it. But again, just tackling this issue and make awareness for the young people, like to understand about the housing or other things that we expected, because expectation is one of the big barrier that we face. Even me, when coming to here, there was so much expectation that I've been hit with it. But again, accepting and moving forward, that's what we wanted for the young people to do as well in their life.
And because of the language barrier, most of our young people kind of find it hard for them to kind of find to belong to the community or to the society. So using the youth forum, we tried to kind of build a network for them. So basically, what we had like is like different groups of young asylum seekers meeting, every week, doing different activities, reading books, doing online games, and then I kind of sharing experience. And then this network became wider and wider, which kind of made us so happy, because now they have a place, even like it's online based, just to kind of find safety in it.
Another things is, so basically the housing and education is, as a youth ambassador, we really find it like the difficult, because we had it as well. I mean, for me coming to here, I wanted to go smoothly to any course that I wanted and be able to be now doing the course that I wanted, which is adult nurse. But it was again, another challenge for me to understand that I need to access GCSE, and understand that I need to have my maths and English, all these things. And then that's what we make this, I mean, address this issue to the young people, get your GCSE, learning the English and maths, because even if you do the course, there will time that they're going to say to you, you don't have GCSE, you don't have maths and English, so they send you back, because this is exactly what happened to me. But not just for the young people to understand this issue, but again, to be able to go to the colleges and make them, to give the young people like the chance to choose what they want to do, and then give them the place that they wanted. So one of the issues is working in education, we've been faced with it.
Our sheet.
So yeah.
So this is me. So starting with youth-led report to respond to that consultation that the government released released about the new immigration bill. So this was one of our big achievements because we worked together with two other organizations called Safe Passage and Hummingbird to write a youth-led report highlighting the issues that hit the refugees and asylum seekers in Kent and also providing alternative solutions. So basically, we just didn't accept that. We always try to kind of make the government understand there are always solutions, but they have to consider this as well.
Yeah, one of the achievements as well, like, is IT training. As I mentioned earlier, the pandemic, it was, we understood that the young people need to learn ITs, whether it can be emails, how to use PowerPoint, Word, and how they can open the computer and doing these things. So we done training for the young people, and then some of them that who now be able like to access it. Again, with the IT training is linking with this like social media, as Bridget mentioned earlier, the Human of Kent. We had so much things that we've done it through the social media, like we achieve it, and then making awareness of people to understand about story, not just what the social media represented negatively.
And then you have spreading awareness. So basically, we always try to kind of educate the people about refugees and asylum seekers here in Kent because it has been always negative comments on social media, and we want them to understand it's not always negative. They need to understand refugees and asylum seekers are human beings and they have the rights to be safe and to live a normal life. So we use like blogs, talk to the media and also telling our stories, this as evidence to kind of show the people what we are capable of.
Just linking back to what Osama says, we do go to schools, like telling our story, and obviously not that much of hard because they are the children, but we do tell our story. We go to we work with a researcher from university who wanted to have like to do research about refugee. So we tell them the story that they needed to know, like from our perspective, and not other things which is really help because we work closely with really nice and famous people who are now raising this issue for us, which is really achievement as well. Colleges and schools and university, that's we've been spreading awareness about refugees. It's my turn. Videos in different language. As in KRAN, there is young people from Afghanistan, Kurdish, Syria, and other things. I speak Arabic and Osama as well, but I speak Tigrinya, which is from Eritrea. So we've done in 5 languages, which is because the mainly young people who comes to KRAN speak this language. So we've done different video from like Tigrinya, English, Arabic, and Vietnam and Kurdish, explaining what KRAN does and explaining what we do in the youth forum so they can have more engaged from the young people to come. And so that was one of the achievements as well. We have done it this.
And then we have built like a great network with other organizations, young leaders, like for example, Safe Passage, also Council Steering Group and for Change Steering Group. We kind of built a huge big network between us and them, and kind of to make this message delivered to everyone in the UK, not just here in Kent.
The Act for Change Festival, it was I believe that's the fund that we get, isn't it, Razia? It was our job that we get it. With the Act for Change, we had really chances that not just an organization that talk about refugee, but again, LGBTQ and disability. So it was really wider network that we learned, and it was really pleased for us to kind of know other people, like not just refugee that who face this issue, but other organization that we have the same like issue that we face it, and how we can come over this challenge. So Act for Change, we've done a festival, which is raise awareness again about refugee and working closely with other organizations as well.
Yeah, and the final thing is, as you said, so basically we have been invited, my family and I, to meet their Royal Highnesses in China.
Yeah.
And we had a normal conversation with them, and it was just an incredible experience. And I was amazed by how they recognize the work we do at the KRAN, because we support the refugees and asylum seekers. And when I told them about the work we do, they were surprised and at the same time amazed. And then we had this big interviews with the IDP and the BBC, where they asked us about how KRAN can support the refugees and asylum seekers in Kenya, and we had like some interviews so far. And I think this huge achievements, all make us provide more support for the young refugees and asylum seekers and ask us to do more and more and not to stop there because, as we always say, this is just the beginning. And our achievement is just like now to convince the government to change this new immigration plan because we believe it's just not fair. It's just, they have to look at it from different perspectives, not just from one single perspective. Because in this situation, you are kind of making millions of people thinking about their families here and they just like feeling desperate. So
I think one of the things that, I mean, recently we've done, as Bridget earlier mentioned, is the Human of Kent. And I have interviewed Patrick, which is well known in Foxton, and I forgot the name, Balvada. No, the actor, what's her name? Balvinda. Yeah, Bal. I can forget the name. Just by having by talking with them, I feel like there's something in common that we do share. And to see that if we didn't know who's this person, background, whether it's refugee, whether any country or whether any belong, we do have in common, whether something we like, whether something we hate. So for people to understand that refugee is not just a person who was the negative, the social media trying to represent, but again, knowing this person and sharing our experiences, that kind of connection that we build with other people. And that's what really we wanted. It's not because just we want to break that barriers, but again, to have that connecting with people. And as a youth ambassador, or not just as a youth ambassador, but as a young person who comes to here, I came to here, I had so much things that have been taken with a positive and negative. But again, to be able to see the positive side is make me really feel happy. And I wanted people to see me as who I am without all these kind of negative things, not knowing who I am and build on that things. But that's what we do in KRAN. And that's, really appreciate to be able to have this platform to spread these things, not for people, but again, for young people, not to feel a fear or afraid to go outside and then to meet other people just because they feel, oh, they're going to judge me or because I'm this kind of person. So yeah, so thank you, KRAN, everyone.
We can take some questions.
Yeah. Yeah, if there's any questions online, I can pose them.
There's
We
one
have a
there.
question there from the audience. So yes, if you could.
Hiya,
Sorry, I forget your name.
Rashan.
Rashan. So good to hear you talking about this.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, you talked about applications they have. And I'm just wondering what your expectations were.
Okay.
So the question was just for those online. The question was about what Rashan's expectations were when she came to the UK.
Okay. So basically one of the expectation, because when I left home, I'm the oldest from my brother and sister. One of the things I thought, if I came here, I would be able to give them the same life when I had it here with my foster carer. Because at the time that when I had so much things with the foster family, like swimming lesson, other things that I never had it back home. So I thought in a time that I thought I'm selfish in a bit because my brother and sister didn't have it. So I wished it that if I can bring them here, they can experience the same love that I had with the support with my foster family. That's one of the expectations that I thought I can have my brother and sister and my mom with me here in the same way I've been supported. Another thing is the education, because when I was doing, I've done health and social care level 1, level 2, and then I was expected that I'm going to be to level 3 and then go to uni straight away. But that was the case. But I learned so much things during that journey. But again, that's one of the young people expectation that they face. And when I tell them that I had the same thing, they understood this part. Because coming to the UK, the first thing you would feel like you would be loved and welcomed, and the same what I had it with my foster family. But when I went outside to the colleges and hearing all these negative things, I was like, oh my goodness, it's not the way that inside. So it was kind of different things. But then I learned, because when I go back to my foster care, I heard these people saying, she pushed me like, no, Roshan, you need to continue. You need to move forward. So much of the expectation is that we're going to be loved because we already face awful things to come to here. But then to see the opposite of it, it kind of hits you and feel mentally like you stress. So much things, if I tell you, it's not going to end. But thank you so much for your question.
I guess I would say the same thing exactly, but if I want to ask anything, I would ask something about my experience as a student, let's say, because when I left Syria, I was 15 and I was so passionate to start university in Jordan when I moved to Jordan, but I didn't have the, this opportunity in Jordan, and I had to work instead of, studying. But when I had the chance, when we knew that we are coming to the UK, the first thing came to my mind to spend the first year maybe in education, and the second year start university, quickly. But it wasn't like this. So I had to go through the education system. So my first year was doing just ESOL. I didn't know anything about functional skills. I didn't know anything about levels in English. I didn't know about anything about like doing GCSEs in English and math. And all this kind of 3 years or the last 4 years was just like for me learning about the education system in the UK. So I expected, for someone to tell me about all of this, about, what should I do to enter university? What should I do to get this level of English? But I didn't have this. So it basically was difficult for me, but it also was learning. So, and this is what we are doing at KRAN now, kind of educate the new arrivals about this, so they don't, fall in the same mistakes.
Same process.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, we've got one question there. Just for the online audience, the question is to do with whether opportunities over the last 10 years for refugees have improved or deteriorated, I suppose.
I don't mind. I mean, seeing what's Pretty Patel say, obviously is going to negative, but that's why we're trying to stop it. I don't know about the last decade or how things was there. I mean, refugee being treated, but one of the thing that I had like made me to come to you, so I thought like it's gonna be better, which is that's what it makes it like looking positive. But coming to here and then seeing, I can see. I mean, since I've been here 6 years, and I can see the difference between how now, in terms of the fund, in terms of the access, in terms of the support is kind of changing. The way that I had it, the support, and the way now things is becoming less. Maybe because refugee became a lot in here, and then that's kind of make excuse that we don't have the fund or the support for that. But that's what we're trying to do. In like, if we can do by ourselves as a refugee, because we're not here just to, as all the media saying, like coming, taking job and doing these things, but we want to do things for ourselves as well, for other young people and help them. But towards positive and negative, I've been seeing the positive side and I've been seeing negative side. And whether it's negative, we're trying to address it. Whether it's positive, we're trying to impress it. So, yeah. Thank you.
We've got a final question from Millstone here.
Question, but where do you think you'd be if you hadn't been helped by KRAN?
Oh, that's really nice. I give you two, and then you have to deal with Razi. I will version it later on.
So to be honest, for myself, I don't know, maybe working in in the restaurants as a kitchen porter, because in KRAN I found, the opportunity to learn, and also they offered me like GCSE classes, and then they offered me to be a trainee, then they offered me this job to be a youth ambassador, which kind of developed me a lot developed me. So basically, just like I can't imagine myself without the KRAN, how far would I go?
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's all true. To be honest, I know KRAN since I came to here, and it was my second family after my foster family. Similar to Usama what says, I've been going to GCSE classes, and that's how I achieved my GCSE, because if I didn't have that support, English is my first language, and to be able to write in a fictional story, no way. But I had this support in classes, not only just the support in terms of the education part, but mentally because I didn't have my family with me, they are my family. They trying to improve me in a way, not just give up on myself and what other negative story and other things, because we hear it, whether I'm a young person or adult, we do hear it everywhere, media, because everyone now using social media. But then going to KRAN, like they push us forward, like to just not for ourselves, but again for the young people. So I don't know what would I do without KRAN, seriously. So yeah, thank you.
Final comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, just another extraordinary set of contributions to the event this year. So just to reprise and thank Daniel very much for a compelling contribution to the situation in Europe for people seeking asylum, fleeing persecution, tinged with a very personal story that was certainly I was unfamiliar with, and others may have been unfamiliar with as well, but very powerful, and indeed maybe reflective of why you do the journalism that you do, very much potentially rooted in that experience. So very powerful. My real takeaway from that, there's an awful lot of takeaways, is that we're into the 74th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was in 1948, put together by a very illustrious group of individuals, men and women. And I fear the real risk is that governments across the developed world are at risk of unpicking what is a really profound piece of legislation, as fit for purpose now as it was in 1948, when that group of people came together and put down that Universal Declaration, which has gone on to protect countless numbers of individuals for all sorts of reasons, but always rooted in human rights. So thank you. I think you gave us a very powerful testament around that too. The work of KRAN is just extraordinary. I think, if nothing else, again, just the way it's linked to what we heard earlier about communities and groups in communities, mobilizing to make the difference, is exactly how it worked in the 1930s when the government did sod all about a group of young people. Actually, it was one individual or a few individuals finding hosts of families who could support this initiative. And that's exactly what KRAN is doing in its community. And that's really vital, because I think the work that they do spreads out. And nowhere is there a greater testament to that which we've heard tonight from Usama and Rushan. Thank you very much. I mean, that has been just the most extraordinary, powerful testament we've heard from you. I mean, ambassadors sort of really doesn't do justice to the importance of the story that you have to tell and that you have to share, not just with politicians and His Royal Highness, but really much more widely with that to change hearts and minds. So thank you very much for that. Really, really moving. And just finally to thank the library, and when I say that, I mean in particular Barbara Warnock as one of our trustees, but also one of the staff here, and Lara tonight, for whom you can't see, but has been sitting there diligently making sure that that this technology has worked, and those people who've been online have been able to be part of this evening as well. So thank you very much as well to all the staff here, and thank you to all of you for pitching up. We've tried to keep it COVID safe, but it's a pretty full room. And thank you again, and we hope to see you at future events as we plan them. Thank you.